My father sat me down 3 days before he died and made me swear on my mother's grave that I would never sell the back 40 acres. He was 71, dying of emphysema, and he could barely get the words out between the oxygen mask and the coughing, but he gripped my hand hard enough to leave marks and said it 3 times. Never sell the back 40, never let anyone build on it, never let anyone go back there without permission. I promised him. I had no idea what I was promising to protect until years later, when I saw what my grandfather had seen in 1927 and understood why our family had prospered on land that broke other ranchers. My name is Wayne Harper. I grew up on a cattle ranch outside Orofino, Idaho, 6 miles south of town on a county road that turns to gravel after 2 miles and dirt after 3. The ranch has been in my family since 1927, when my grandfather Claude Harper bought 640 acres of timber and grassland from the federal government for $8 an acre. The property runs along Orofino Creek for 1.5 miles and climbs into the foothills of the Clearwater Mountains. The back 40 sits at the highest elevation, tucked against Forest Service land that stretches unbroken for hundreds of square miles into the Nez Perce National Forest. Dense timber, steep terrain, and country so remote that even hunters avoid it because getting an elk out of there requires a pack team and 3 days of hard work. I am 62 years old. I worked this ranch my entire life except for 3 years in the Army. I married Donna in 1986 and we raised 2 sons, Kyle and Travis. Both moved to Lewiston after high school and never looked back, except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Donna died of breast cancer in 2009. I have lived alone here 16 years, running 120 head of cattle, fixing fence that never stays fixed, cutting hay that barely pays for the diesel, and keeping the promise I made to my father in March of 2008 when he was dying in a hospital bed in Lewiston and could barely speak, but made sure I understood that the back 40 was not negotiable. The back 40 has never been grazed, never been logged, never been developed since my grandfather bought the property 98 years ago. It sits behind a locked gate at the end of a ranch road that climbs through ponderosa pine and Douglas fir so thick you lose sight of the sky within a quarter-mile. My father maintained that road enough to keep it passable by truck in dry weather, but barely. 2 ruts with grass growing between them washed out in places blocked by fallen timber and others. He drove back there maybe 4 times a year, always alone, always early morning or late evening when the light was low and the shadows were long. When I was 8, I asked him why we did not graze cattle on those acres when the grass was thick and the terrain was not too steep for stock. He told me the back 40 was reserved. I asked for what? He said for the agreement. That answer meant nothing to me, but I remembered the way he said it, like the agreement was a living thing that required feeding and attention, and violating it would be worse than losing money or cattle or land. I did not go to the back 40 until I was 16. August of 1979. My father was in Lewiston overnight getting parts for the bowler that had broken during first cutting. I took his truck keys from the hook by the kitchen door, drove up the ranch road, unlocked the gate with the key he kept on a chain around his neck, and kept going. The road climbed another mile before it ended in a clearing surrounded by old-growth ponderosa and western larch. There was a fire ring made of river stones in the center, and beside it was a stump cut flat like a table. On the stump were 3 objects arranged in a deliberate line: a jar of honey, the kind my mother used for canning, a bundle of dried jerky tied with butcher's twine, a sack of apples from our own trees. I recognized the variety because I had picked them myself 2 weeks earlier. I stood there trying to figure out who had left them and why. The clearing was 6 miles from town behind a locked gate on private property that nobody had permission to access. The food was fresh. The honey jar had condensation on the inside, which meant it had been opened recently. The jerky smelled like smoke and salt. The apples were firm, not wrinkled or soft. Someone from our ranch had been up here within the last day or two and left food in the middle of the woods for reasons I could not begin to understand. I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked into the timber beyond. The forest was dense and silent in the way that forests are silent when predators are near. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, just wind in the high branches and the distant sound of Orofino Creek, maybe half a mile downslope. I was about to walk back to the truck when I saw the structure. It was 30 yards into the trees, built against a massive larch trunk that must have been 5 feet across at the base, dome-shaped, maybe 7 feet high and 10 feet across at the base, made from branches woven together in a tight lattice and covered with layers of bark and moss that blended into the surrounding forest so well I almost missed it. The doorway was low and round, facing away from the clearing toward deeper timber. I had never seen anything like it. Too large and too well made to be a fort built by kids, and besides, no kids from town would hike 6 miles into the mountains to build a fort on private property behind a locked gate. I walked toward it, got within 15 feet when the smell hit me, heavy, musky, part animal and part something else I could not identify, thick enough that I could taste it at the back of my throat. Not the smell of rot or decay, the smell of something alive, something large, something that had been using this structure recently. Every instinct I had, the ones you do not question when you are 16 and alone in the woods, far from help, told me to turn around and leave, so I did. I drove back down the mountain and put the truck keys back on the hook and never told my father I had gone up there. But 2 days later, he asked me directly if I had been to the back 40. I lied and said no. He looked at me for a long time, the way he looked at me when he knew I was lying but was giving me one chance to correct it. Then he said, if I ever did go back there, I needed to understand something. The back 40 was not ours. Not really. We owned it on paper, had the deed filed at the courthouse in Lewiston, paid taxes on it every year. But something else had lived there long before we showed up, and my grandfather had made an agreement when he bought the property in 27 that we would leave that part alone. He said the agreement was why our ranch never had trouble with predators taking calves when neighboring ranches lost dozens every year to cougars and bears. Why our water never ran dry, even in drought years when other creeks in the valley went to trickles. Why our timber never burned when fires swept through and took out entire hillsides on neighboring properties. He said the agreement was the reason our family had prospered on this land for over 50 years while other families went broke and sold out, and breaking it would be the worst mistake I could make. I asked what he meant by something else. He told me I would understand when I was older and that until then, I needed to stay out of the back 40 and never ask about it again. I was 16 and stubborn and wanted to push, but something in his voice stopped me. He was not angry, he was afraid. My father was not a man who showed fear. He had worked in the woods his entire life, had faced down black bears and cougars, had worked logging operations where men died regularly from widow makers and cable breaks, and I had never seen him back down from anything. But when he talked about the back 40, his hands shook. I stayed away for 6 years, graduated high school, did my time in the Army, came back in '84 and started working the ranch full time. The back 40 sat in the back of my mind like a question I was not ready to ask. Then in 1985, my father had his accident. He was working a timber sale on Forest Service land adjacent to our property, felling a dead ponderosa that the service had marked for removal because it was a fire hazard. The tree barber shared, which is what happens when a tree splits vertically up the trunk during the fall and kicks back toward the cutter with force that can kill. The butt end of that ponderosa came back and caught him across the chest and left shoulder, crushed 3 ribs, broke his collarbone in 2 places, and tore his rotator cuff so badly that the surgeon in Lewiston said he was lucky to keep the arm. 2 weeks in the hospital, another month at home before he could move his left arm without screaming. During that month, he could not drive, could not work, could barely dress himself. I ran everything, the cattle, the equipment, the bills, the repairs that never stopped. In late October, about 6 weeks after the accident, my father called me into the living room and told me I needed to make a delivery to the back 40. He was sitting in his recliner with his arm in a sling, looking thinner than I had ever seen him, pale from being indoors for weeks. He told me to go to the root cellar and get 2 jars of honey, the ones my mother had put up in September from the hives we kept behind the barn. Go to the freezer, and get a package of jerky, the venison he had made in August from a buck he shot on the property. Go to cold storage and get a sack of apples, the ones from the trees his father had planted in the 30s. Drive to the back 40. Leave the food on the stump in the clearing. Come straight back. Do not linger. Do not explore. Do not make noise. Just leave the food and go. I asked why. He said because it was October and the agreement required it. Twice a year, he said, April and October, every year since 1927. I asked what agreement. He said the same one his father made when he bought the land. I asked who with. He looked at me with those pale blue eyes that had seen more than 70 years of hard living and said I would find out soon enough if I kept my word and stayed quiet. I made the delivery. I put the food on the stump exactly as he described, got back in the truck. But before I started the engine, I looked at the tree line on the far side of the clearing, and I saw something standing in the shadows between two large ponderosas, tall, taller than any man I had ever seen, at least 7.5 feet, maybe 8, broad through the chest and shoulders with arms that hung past its knees, covered in hair, dark brown, almost black, thick enough that I could not make out the shape of the body underneath except for the general outline. The face was partially visible in the dappled light, heavy brow ridge that shadowed deep-set eyes, wide nose, a jaw that was broader and more prominent than any human jaw, but not like an ape either. Something in between, but the eyes were what stopped me. They were watching me with a focus that was not animal. There was intention in that gaze, awareness, the recognition that I was there and that I was being measured and judged. I sat in the truck with my hand on the door handle, engine off, not moving. Neither did the figure in the trees. We looked at each other for what might have been 30 seconds, might have been 2 minutes. Time stretched and compressed in that silence. Then it took one step backward, deeper into the shadows, and it was gone. Not running, not crashing through brush the way a bear or elk would. Just gone, absorbed into the forest with a silence that something that large and that heavy should not have been capable of producing. I drove back down the mountain, and I walked into the house, and I sat down across from my father in the living room, and I told him what I had seen. He nodded slowly, like I had just confirmed something he had been waiting for me to say my entire life. Then he told me the whole story. My grandfather, Claude Harper, bought this land in spring of 1927 from a federal land office in Lewiston. 640 acres for just over $5,000, which was most of the money he had saved working in the mines around Wallace and the logging camps around Coeur d'Alene from the time he was 14 years old. The land had been surveyed and sectioned during the 1890s, but never homesteaded because it was too far from town, too rough for farming, and the timber was not worth enough at the time to justify the cost of getting it out. Cattle and timber country, nothing more. My grandfather did not care about any of that. He wanted land that was his own, and he was willing to work it however it would yield. The first summer he was on the property, he grazed cattle all the way to the back boundary, and he cut timber on the slopes above Orofino Creek to sell to the mill in town. The cattle did fine on the native grass. The timber work went well, bringing in enough money to pay down the land debt. But in late August of that first year, something started taking calves. Not wolves, though there were wolves in the area at that time. Not cougars, though there were plenty of those too. The calves were not eaten or dragged off. They were found dead in the pasture, necks broken clean with a precision that suggested hands, not teeth. My grandfather lost 7 calves in 2 weeks, and he was losing money he could not afford to lose on a ranch he had barely started. He set up to watch the herd one night in early September, slept in his truck parked at the edge of the pasture with a 30-06 across his lap and a thermos of coffee that his wife Edith had made for him. Around 2 in the morning, he saw something moving through the pasture toward the herd. It was upright, walking on 2 legs, and it was large enough that he could see it clearly in the moonlight from 200 yards away. He raised the rifle, put the scope on the figure, got a clear shot. The figure stopped walking, turned, and looked directly at him, directly at the truck, as if it had known he was there the entire time. My grandfather said the hair on his arm stood straight up and his finger froze on the trigger because he understood in that moment that whatever he was looking at knew he was armed and knew he was watching and was not afraid of either. The figure raised one arm and gestured toward the high end of the property, toward what would become the back 40, a deliberate gesture unmistakable in meaning even across 200 yards of moonlit pasture. Then it turned and walked in that direction, moving with a gait that covered ground faster than my grandfather expected, smooth and efficient and purposeful. He sat in the truck for a long time trying to decide what to do. Then he started the engine and followed. He drove up the ranch road as far as it went at that time, which was only about half a mile past where the gate is now. Then he got out and walked. Followed the sound of something moving through the timber ahead of him, heavy footsteps that he could hear even over the sound of wind in the trees. After about 20 minutes of walking uphill through dense forest, he came to the clearing, the same clearing where I left the food in '85, the same clearing where I had seen the figure standing in the trees 2 hours earlier. There were three of them. One large male, the same one my grandfather had seen in the pasture, standing maybe 8 feet tall with shoulders as broad as a door. One smaller, probably female based on body proportions, standing maybe 6.5 feet tall. And a juvenile, maybe 4 feet tall, standing between the adults with one hand holding on to what my grandfather assumed was its mother. They were waiting for him, not hiding, not aggressive, just standing in the clearing in the moonlight, waiting to see what he would do. The large male stepped forward and made a sound, a low vocalization that came from deep in its chest, carried across the clearing with a resonance my grandfather said he felt in his own sternum. Not language as he understood it, but loaded with meaning nonetheless. He said it sounded like a question, though he could not have told you what question it was asking. My grandfather was a practical man. He had worked hard jobs in dangerous places his entire life, and he understood that the world contained things he did not have names for. When confronted with one of those things, the smart play was not to fight it, but to find a way to live alongside it. So he stood in that clearing with three beings that should not exist according to everything he had been taught, and he made a proposal. He pointed to the back 40 acres, the highest and most remote part of his new property, gestured to the timber and the terrain, and said out loud, speaking slowly and clearly in case they could understand English, that if they would leave his cattle alone, he would leave this part of the land alone. No grazing, no logging, no development of any kind. It would remain theirs. He would bring food twice a year, in April after snowmelt and in October before winter, and leave it in this clearing as a gesture of good faith. In return, he wanted protection for his herd and his timber from predators and fire. He wanted prosperity for his family. He wanted an agreement that would last as long as the Harpers worked this land. The large male listened. My grandfather said he could not explain how he knew it was listening, how he knew it understood, but there was a quality of attention in the way it stood, in the way it tilted its head slightly, in the way its eyes never left his face that made him certain the meaning was getting across. When my grandfather finished speaking, the male stepped forward, closed the distance between them to about 10 feet, reached out one massive hand and touched the trunk of a ponderosa pine next to where my grandfather was standing, pressed its palm against the bark hard with force that made the tree shudder. When it pulled the hand away, there was a deep print left in the wood, a handprint clear and unmistakable with 4 fingers and a thumb, each digit as thick as a broom handle. The print was pressed into the bark deep enough that my grandfather could fit his own fingers into the impression and feel how far into the wood it went. Then the male made another vocalization, shorter this time, rising in pitch at the end in a way that sounded affirmative. It turned and walked into the forest with the other two following, and within seconds they had disappeared into the timber as completely as if they had never been there. My grandfather took that as acceptance. He left the clearing, walked back to his truck, drove home, told his wife Edith what had happened, and she looked at him like he had lost his mind from exhaustion and stress. He did not argue with her, just said he would prove it in the morning. And the next morning, when he rode out to check the herd at first light, every calf that had been killed in the previous 2 weeks was lying in a line along the fence near the barn, not scattered in the pasture where they had died, arranged deliberately in a row, necks still broken but bodies positioned with care, like someone settling a debt and making sure the payment was visible and understood. My grandfather buried them in a mass grave near the creek and never lost another calf to predators for the rest of his life. 41 years he ran cattle on this ranch, and not once did a cougar or bear or wolf touch his stock, even when neighboring ranches were losing animals every season. Twice a year, in April and in October, he drove to the back 40 and left food on the stump in the clearing. Honey, jerky, apples, sometimes smoked fish from steelhead he caught in Orofino Creek, sometimes dried venison from deer he shot on the property. Never saw the beings again clearly, not up close, but he knew they were there. He could feel them watching from the trees when he made the deliveries. And the agreement held. The ranch prospered, the cattle multiplied, the timber stayed healthy. Fires that swept through neighboring properties and burned thousands of acres stopped at the boundary of our land as if they hit an invisible wall. The Forest Service called it luck, said our land had natural fire breaks that others did not. My grandfather called it the agreement. He passed the responsibility to my father when he died in '68, and my father kept it for 40 years. Twice a year, every year, the deliveries were made. The back 40 stayed untouched. The Harpers stayed protected. I watched my father make those deliveries from the time I was old enough to remember until the accident in '85 forced me to take over. After that first sighting, after he told me the story, I understood what I was part of. Not a superstition, not a family legend, an actual working agreement with beings that existed in those mountains, whether science acknowledged them or not. My father finished the story that day in October of '85, and he looked at me and said, it was my turn now. He said I needed to keep the agreement, not because I believed in it, though belief would come in time, but because breaking it would bring consequences I was not prepared to face. He said the beings in the back 40 were not animals. They were intelligent, they were old, and they had long memories. Respect them and they would respect us. Violate the agreement and we would lose everything our family had built. I kept the agreement for 37 years. From '85 until today, I have made the deliveries. April and October without fail. Every single year. I have seen them 4 more times since that first sighting. Always at a distance, always at the edge of the tree line, always watching. I have never approached them beyond what was necessary, never tried to photograph them or document them or prove to anyone else that they exist. The agreement is built on discretion, and I honor that because I have seen what happens when you honor it, and I have no desire to find out what happens when you do not. In 2008, when my father was dying, he made me promise I would never sell the back 40. He was in a hospital bed in Lewiston, hooked up to machines that were keeping him alive, but barely, and he used what little strength he had left to grip my hand and make me swear. He said developers had been sniffing around for years wanting to buy pieces of the ranch for vacation homes and recreational cabins. He said the value of the land had gone up enough that I could sell off 100 acres and live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever working another day. But he said if I sold the back 40, if I let anyone build back there or disturb what had been protected since 1927, the agreement would be broken and I would regret it for whatever time I had left. He did not elaborate on what regret would look like, and I did not ask. I just promised. He died 3 days later. I buried him next to my mother in the Orofino Cemetery on a gray March morning with sleet coming down and maybe 20 people in attendance because most of the people who had known him were already dead themselves. I came home and I kept working the ranch and I kept making the deliveries. 10 years ago in 2015, a real estate developer from Boise named Rick Coleman contacted me about purchasing 200 acres on the eastern side of the property. He had a plan for a luxury subdivision, high-end homes for people from Boise and Spokane who wanted mountain retreats where they could pretend to be rural on weekends while keeping their six-figure jobs in the city. He offered me $2.8 million for the acreage, which included the back 40. I told him the back 40 was not for sale. He said he would pay extra for it, that the elevation and the views made it the most desirable part of the entire property, worth more per acre than anything else I own. I told him no. He kept calling, sent letters on fancy letterhead with legal language about right of first refusal and good faith negotiation. Showed up at my door twice with contracts already drawn up, just needed my signature. I told him the back 40 was off limits, not negotiable, not for sale at any price, and if he did not stop bothering me, I would file a restraining order. He finally gave up after 8 months of pushing, but not before telling me I was a fool for sitting on land I was not using when I could retire with enough money to live anywhere I wanted for the rest of my life. I thought about that conversation for a long time. After he stopped calling, I thought about the fact that I was 60 years old, working alone on a ranch that was getting harder to manage every year, with knees that did not work right anymore, and a back that seized up if I lifted anything heavier than a hay bale wrong. I thought about the money, 2.8 million. More money than my family had ever seen in 3 generations of working this land. I thought about the life I could have if I sold. A small house in town, no more 18-hour days, no more equipment breaking down at the worst possible time, no more wondering if I would make it through another winter without the bank calling about the loan I took out to pay for legal fees fighting the county road proposal. But then I thought about my grandfather standing in a clearing in 1927 making a promise to something the rest of the world refused to believe in. I thought about my father gripping my hand in a hospital bed 3 days before he died, begging me not to break that promise. I thought about what prosperity looked like over 3 generations on land that should have broken us the way it broke other families, and I understood that the prosperity was not luck and it was not good management. It was the agreement. And the moment I broke it, everything would stop. The protection, the good fortune, the invisible hand that had guided this ranch through depressions and droughts and market crashes that destroyed other operations. All of it would stop and I would be left with money in the bank and nothing worth protecting. So I did not sell. But the pressure did not stop. In 2018, the county started pushing for a new access road through the eastern part of the ranch to connect to Forest Service land for fire suppression purposes. The Forest Service wanted better access for their crews during fire season, and the route they proposed cut through prime grazing land and ran within a quarter-mile of the back 40. I fought it. Hired a lawyer in Lewiston named Beth Morrison who specialized in property rights and land use law. Filed objections with the County Planning Commission. Showed up at every single public meeting for 8 months, sitting in folding chairs in the basement of the county courthouse while the commissioners listened to everyone who had an opinion. The Forest Service argued it was about public safety. I argued it was about private property rights and unnecessary taking. I never mentioned the real reason I was fighting, which was that a road that close to the back 40 would bring people, and people would explore, and eventually someone would push past the locked gate and find the clearing and see things they should not see. The county finally agreed to reroute the road farther south, adding 2 miles to the proposed length and $300,000 to the cost, which made them deeply unhappy with me. It cost me $11,000 in legal fees, money I did not have, and I had to take out a loan against the ranch to pay for it. The banker in Orofino who processed the loan looked at me like I was insane, borrowing money at my age to fight a road that would have benefited fire protection for the entire area. I could not explain, so I just signed the paperwork and paid the lawyer and went home. Then in 2020, during the fires that burned through Idaho and Washington and filled the sky with smoke for 2 months straight, a Forest Service crew wanted to establish a fire line through the back 40 to protect the town of Orofino from a blaze that was moving east out of the Nez Perce. The incident commander, a man named Dan Pritchard, who ran fire operations for the region, came to my door at 6 in the morning and told me his crew needed access immediately. They wanted to cut a fuel break from the ridge above my property down through the back 40 to the creek, clear-cutting everything in a strip 200 feet wide to stop the fire if it jumped the river. I refused. Dan looked at me like I had just set the town on fire myself. He said I was being reckless and stubborn and that if the fire jumped to our property and spread into town and took out homes, it would be on me and I would have to live with that for the rest of my life. I told him to build the line south of the back 40 and I would help dig it myself with my own equipment. He said I was insane. I said he did not understand what he was asking me to violate. He made a note in his incident report and left, and I later heard from someone in town that he had recommended criminal charges against me for obstructing emergency operations. The county prosecutor declined to pursue it. The fire never made it to our property anyway. Burned itself out 20 miles north after a rainstorm came through and dropped 3 inches in 2 days. Dan Pritchard still will not speak to me when we cross paths in town. Every time someone pushes to develop or access or disturb the back 40, I fight it. Every time it costs me money I do not have and goodwill I cannot afford to lose. People in town think I am a stubborn old man sitting on land I'm not using for reasons I will not explain, and they are half right. I am stubborn, but the reasons I cannot explain are the only reasons that matter. I am 62 years old. My knees are bad from a lifetime of climbing in and out of trucks and working on uneven ground. My back is worse, compressed vertebrae from years of lifting hay bales and fence posts and calves that needed pulling. I am running a ranch by myself that should take 3 men to manage properly, and I'm doing it badly because there are not enough hours in the day and I am not strong enough anymore to do everything that needs doing. I have thought many times about selling. Not the back 40, never the back 40, but the rest of it. Keeping the house and maybe 50 acres around it, letting go of the rest, using the money to hire help or fix the equipment that keeps breaking or live out my remaining years without the constant grind of debt and work and worry. But whoever bought the land would want access to all of it. They would want to log the timber, graze the pastures, build roads and houses and infrastructure. And eventually, whether by accident or by intention, someone would push into the back 40 and the agreement would be tested in ways it has not been tested since my grandfather made it 98 years ago. 2 months ago, late February of this year, I was feeding cattle in the lower pasture when I saw smoke coming from the direction of the back 40. Not a lot, just a thin column rising above the tree line in air so cold it was visible from 3 miles away. I got in the truck and drove up the ranch road faster than I should have on ice and packed snow. When I got to the clearing, there was a fire burning in the stone ring that had been cold and unused since my last delivery in October, and standing beside the fire was the largest of them I had ever seen. Over 8 feet tall, heavily built through the chest and shoulders, with hair that was graying around the face and neck the way human hair grays with age. It was old. I could see it in the way it stood, slightly stooped, with deliberate movements that spoke of a body that had carried weight for a very long time and was starting to feel the cost. It looked at me as I got out of the truck, and it made a sound, a low, sustained vocalization that carried a tone I had never heard in all the years of making deliveries. It was not a greeting. It was not a warning. It was a summons. Something had happened that required my presence, and the old one had built a fire in the middle of winter to make sure I saw it and came. I walked toward the fire, stopped about 10 feet away. The old one watched me, then stepped aside and gestured toward the flames with one massive hand. I looked where it was gesturing and saw what it wanted me to see. Lying on the ground beside the fire ring, wrapped in what looked like woven bark blankets, was a younger one. Not a juvenile, but not fully grown either, maybe 6.5 feet tall, lying on its side with its eyes closed. Its breathing was labored and shallow, and I could hear a wet rattle in its chest every time it inhaled. Pneumonia, I thought immediately, or something very close to it. The young one was sick, badly sick, and the old one had built a fire to keep it warm and then summoned me because it understood I had tools and knowledge that might help. The old one made another sound, softer this time, and pointed to the younger one and then to me. It was asking for help. No, not asking. It was telling me that help was needed and that I was the one who needed to provide it. There was no question in the gesture, no uncertainty, just the expectation that I would do what needed to be done because that was part of the agreement too, apparently. Not just food twice a year and leaving the land alone. Help when it was needed. I am not a doctor, I am a rancher. But I have treated sick cattle for 40 years, pulled calves with pneumonia back from the edge more times than I can count, and I know what respiratory distress looks like across species. I went back to the truck and got the medical kit I keep behind the seat, the one with antibiotics and syringes and bandages and everything else I might need if a cow gets hurt far from the barn. I had amoxicillin in a large animal formulation that I use for calves with respiratory infections, broad-spectrum antibiotic that works on most bacterial pneumonias. I had no idea if it would work on whatever these beings were, if their biology was close enough to ours for human or veterinary medicine to be effective, but it was what I had. And doing something was better than doing nothing. I approached the younger one slowly. The old one watched but did not stop me. I knelt beside the sick one and felt its forehead the way I would check a calf for fever. It was burning up, skin radiating heat that told me the fever was well over 100 degrees, maybe 105 or higher. Its breathing was rapid and shallow, each breath accompanied by that wet rattle that meant fluid in the lungs. I pulled out the amoxicillin in a syringe and loaded a dose that I hoped was appropriate for something that size and weight. The old one made a sound, sharp and questioning. I looked up, holding the syringe where it could see, and I pantomimed an injection into my own arm. The old one looked at the syringe, looked at me, and then it nodded. A clear, deliberate, unmistakable nod of the head up and down, the universal human gesture for yes. It understood what I was about to do, and it was giving permission. I gave the injection into the muscle of the younger one's shoulder. It flinched, but did not cry out. I gave it water from a bottle in my truck, tipping the bottle carefully to its mouth and watching it drink in small sips. Then I added more wood to the fire from deadfall at the edge of the clearing, and I sat there with them for 2 hours, monitoring the younger one's breathing and giving it more water when it would take it. By late afternoon, the younger one's breathing had eased slightly. The rattle was still there, but not as pronounced, and the rhythm was slower, less panicked. I gave a second dose of antibiotics and told the old one in English, knowing it probably did not understand the words, but hoping it understood the intent, that I would come back the next day with more medicine and that the young one needed to stay warm and drink water. I came back every day for a week. Each time the old one was there, tending the fire, keeping the temperature in the clearing warm enough that the young one did not lose more heat. Each day the young one improved, breathing easier, drinking more, opening its eyes and watching me with what I swear was recognition. By the 5th day, it was sitting up on its own. By the 7th, it was on its feet, shaky but upright. On the 8th day, when I arrived at the clearing with another round of antibiotics, they were both gone. The fire had been carefully extinguished, every ember smothered, the clearing swept clean of ash and debris, and on the stump where I usually left food, there was an object I had never seen before. It was a carved piece of wood, maybe 8 inches long and 2 inches across, shaped into the rough figure of a human standing beside a much larger figure. The craftsmanship was crude but deliberate, made with stone tools, judging from the scrape marks and gouges that metal blades do not leave. The human figure had its hand raised, holding something that might have been a syringe or might have been a stick. Hard to tell at that scale. The larger figure had its hand on the human figure's shoulder. A gift, a thank you. Payment for services rendered in a currency that meant more than yampa roots or honey or anything else that could be traded. This was personal. This was acknowledgement of a debt that went beyond the agreement my grandfather made in 1927. This was between me and the old one, between me and the young one whose life I might have saved. I took the carving home. It sits on my mantel now, next to photographs of my father and my grandfather, next to my mother's Bible in the Purple Heart my brother Travis earned in Vietnam before he died of cancer in '97. It is the only physical proof I have that the agreement is real, that the beings in the back 40 exist, that I am not insane or delusional or making up stories to justify stubbornness, and it is proof I will never show to anyone who would not understand what it represents, because showing it would mean explaining it, and explaining it would mean exposing them, and I will not do that. 3 weeks ago, Rick Coleman called again. New proposal. Buy the entire ranch, all 640 acres, for $8.2 million. Turn it into a conservation subdivision, low density with large lots. I could retain a life estate, live in the house as long as I want, never work again. Best offer I will ever get, he said. Turning it down would be insane. I told him I would think about it. I have been thinking for 3 weeks. I am 62. My body is breaking down. I have no one to pass the ranch to. Kyle and Travis made it clear they have no interest. When I die, the land goes to them, and I do not trust they will keep the agreement. They have never been to the back 40. They do not know what lives there. They will see $8 million and sell without hesitation. Last night, I drove to the back 40, did not bring food, just sat in the truck and waited. After an hour, the older one appeared at the tree line, the same one I helped with the sick younger one. It stood looking at me. I got out and walked toward it. It did not retreat. I stopped 15 feet away. I said out loud that I did not know how much longer I could keep the agreement. I was old and tired, and the world was pushing harder than ever. I wanted to honor the promise my grandfather made, but I was afraid when I was gone there would be no one left. It listened, then it stepped forward, closing distance to about 6 feet, and reached out one massive hand and placed it on my shoulder. The weight enormous, but pressure gentle. It held me for maybe 5 seconds, then withdrew and stepped back. It made a sound, a single sustained note that was not language but carried meaning I felt in my chest. Reassurance, acknowledgement, a reminder that the agreement was not just about land or protection. It was about respect between two groups who shared a place, and that respect had held nearly 100 years because both sides honored it. I drove home. I called Rick Coleman this morning and told him the ranch is not for sale. Not now, not ever. He said I was making a mistake. I told him I was keeping a promise. He hung up. I do not know what will happen when I am gone. I have written instructions locked in my office safe, explaining the back 40, the deliveries, the history. I included copies of my grandfather's diary from 27 where he wrote about the encounter and the handprint. I included the carved figure wrapped in cloth with a note saying it was given to me in 2025 by one of the beings my family has protected for 4 generations. Whether my sons will believe it, I do not know. But I have done what I can. I have kept the agreement. I have protected the back 40. I have honored the promise my grandfather made to something that was here long before property lines and deeds and the idea that land could be owned. My father made me swear I would never sell the back 40. I kept that promise. And sitting here now, looking out the window at the mountains rising behind the ranch, at the tree line where the back 40 begins and the world most people know ends, I understand why he made me swear. It was not about the land. It was about understanding that we are not alone here, that the forests hold more than we acknowledge, and that some agreements are worth keeping even when the cost is everything you thought you wanted. The back 40 will remain. As long as I am alive, it will remain untouched, unlogged, ungrazed, protected. And when I am gone, I can only hope that whoever comes after me will look at the trees and the silence and the weight of something watching from the shadows, and they will understand that some promises are older than money and stronger than any deed, and breaking them is not a mistake you walk away from. My name is Wayne Harper. I am 62 years old. I run a cattle ranch outside Orofino, Idaho, and I keep a promise my grandfather made in 1927. The back 40 is not mine to sell. It never was. It belongs to something that was here first, and as long as I draw breath, I will make sure it stays that way. The agreement holds. The deliveries continue. And in the deep timber at the back of the property, where the ranch road ends and the wilderness begins, something old and watchful waits in the shadows, honoring its side of a bargain that has lasted nearly a century. Not because it has to, because it chooses to. Because respect, once given and returned, builds a trust that no contract or law or deed can replicate. I will drive up there again in October. I will leave honey and jerky and apples on the stump in the clearing, and I will know without seeing them that they are there, watching, waiting, holding to the same promise that has kept my family safe and prosperous for 98 years. And if Rick Coleman calls again, or if the county pushes for another road, or if the Forest Service wants access, I will fight them. Not because I am stubborn, not because I am foolish, but because I made a promise to my father, and he made a promise to his father, and my grandfather made a promise to something the rest of the world refuses to see. Some promises are worth everything. This one is worth the back 40, and the back 40 is worth more than any price Rick Coleman could ever offer, because it holds the last remnants of something ancient and irreplaceable. And losing it would mean losing the last thread of an agreement that has defined my family for 100 years. The back 40 stays. The agreement holds. And when I stand in that clearing in October with the wind moving through the ponderosas and the weight of eyes on me from the tree line, I will know I kept my word. To my father, to my grandfather, and to the beings in the timber who have trusted us to honor our side of a promise that should never be broken. I need to tell you what happened last month because it changed everything. Early April, time for spring delivery. I loaded the truck and drove up just after dawn. As I carried food to the stump, I heard a child crying, not human. The sound was wrong, deeper in pitch, with resonance that carried through trees in a way human voices do not, but unmistakably a young one in distress from somewhere in the timber beyond the clearing. I walked toward the sound. Training said, stay in the clearing, leave food, go home, but the crime pulled at something that overrode training. I pushed through timber about 50 yards until I came to a small ravine. At the bottom, wedged between rocks, was a young one, maybe 3 years old based on size, 4 feet tall, covered in lighter brown hair, left leg caught between rocks at an angle that told me it was broken. The young one was crying and pulling at the trapped leg. Standing on the bank above were two adults. The female, probably the mother, was making continuous soft vocalizations. The male was pacing, agitated, trying to figure out how to extract the young one without making the injury worse. They saw me. Both went rigid. The male moved between me and the trapped young one, but he did not charge. He looked at me, then at the young one, and I saw in his face the same expression I saw in my own father's face when I broke my arm falling off a horse at 9. Desperation, a parent watching their child suffer and unable to fix it. I held up both hands. I said slowly and clearly that I wanted to help. I pointed to the young one, then to myself, made a lifting motion. The male watched, looked at the female. She made a sound, soft and questioning. He responded. They were deciding whether to trust me. The male stepped aside. I climbed into the ravine. The young one stopped crying when I got close, just watched with huge dark eyes filled with pain and fear. I examined the trapped leg. The break was in the lower part, foot wedged tight between rocks shifted during spring runoff. I could not pull the foot free without risking more damage. I looked at the male and gestured to the rocks. I needed help. He understood immediately. He climbed down, and together we worked to shift the larger rock. Must have weighed 300 pounds. I put everything into moving it, barely budged. The male set his hands under the edge and lifted. The rock moved like foam. He held it while I carefully extracted the foot, then set it down with shocking control. The young one was free, but the leg was badly broken. I could see displacement through the hair. It needed to be set and splinted soon before swelling made it impossible. I looked at the female and made a splinting motion. She watched, then nodded. The same clear, deliberate nod. I went to the truck, got everything I could use, duct tape, gauze from the medical kit, 2 straight branches cut from young alder. I knelt beside the young one. The mother sat next to her child, held the young one's upper body while I worked. Setting a break is not complicated, but it hurts. The young one cried out when I pulled the bone into alignment. The male above tense, the mother held tighter, but she did not stop me. She understood. I splinted the leg as well as I could, branches on either side, wrapped tight with gauze and duct tape, crude, but it would hold. When I finished, the mother reached out and touched my hand, just briefly, fingertips against the back of my hand. A thank you. The most genuine I have ever received. The male lifted the young one as easily as I would lift a newborn calf, cradled it against his chest. The young one buried his face in his shoulder. The female climbed out. The male followed with the child. I climbed out last. We stood there, the four of us. The male seemed to understand my hesitation about what to do next. He made a vocalization, then turned and walked into timber with the young one. The female followed. Before she disappeared, she stopped and looked back. She placed one hand over her chest, over where her heart would be, held it there for a long moment. Then she turned and followed her family into the forest. I stood alone and realized something that had been building for 37 years, but never fully crystallized until that moment. The agreement was not a business transaction. It was a relationship between two groups who shared a landscape built on acts of trust so deep that a mother would let a stranger touch her injured child because that stranger had proven over generations that he could be trusted. My grandfather started it, my father maintained it, and I had just deepened it in a way none of us had before. I made deliveries every month after that, not just April and October. I brought medical supplies, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, bandages. I left them on the stump with food. Each time I came back, they were gone. In June, I found something new, a bundle wrapped in bark tied with plant fiber. Inside were pieces of dried root. I took them to a botanist at University of Idaho in Moscow. She identified them as yampa root, wild carrot relative from high mountain meadows. Processed to concentrate starches and preserve them, technique associated with traditional indigenous food preparation. I understood. Payment. Not for medical care, that was freely given. Payment for supplies I had been bringing monthly, ones that cost money I did not have much of. I did not need payment, but I accepted it because refusing would have been an insult. The agreement had always been reciprocal. In August, I found the young one. I was making a delivery. As I walked to the stump, I heard a sound from the tree line. A short, bright vocalization, almost playful. I turned. Standing at the clearing edge was the young one I had splinted in April, walking, not limping. Walking normally, gait showing no sign of the break. The young one looked at me and raised one hand. A wave, a child's wave, enthusiastic and uncoordinated. I waved back. It made a sound I swear was laughter, then turned and ran into timber, moving with speed and agility that told me the leg had healed perfectly. The mother appeared a moment later. She did not wave, just stood and looked at me. I looked at her. No words needed. Her child was whole. I had played a part. The debt between our families, started in 27, had just deepened in a way that would carry forward as long as either family existed on this land. Last week, Kyle called from Lewiston. He is 41, works HVAC, has two kids I barely see. He and Travis have been talking. They think it is time for me to sell. Too old to manage alone, worried I will work myself to death. Rick Coleman still interested. $8 million is more money than our family has seen. Turning it down is foolish. I told Kyle about the back 40. The whole story, my grandfather in the pasture in 27, the handprint, the deliveries for 98 years, the young one with the broken leg, the carved figure, all of it. Kyle was quiet. Then he said, "Dad, you need to see someone." Gently, the way you talk to someone you love who you think is losing their grip. He understood I had spent my life on this ranch and leaving was hard, but making up stories about Bigfoot to justify staying was not healthy. I told him I was not making it up. Come to the ranch, I would take him to the back 40 and show him. He said he did not have time, and even if he did, it would not change his mind. When I died, he and Travis were going to sell, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. He was right. Legally, nothing I can do. I can leave instructions and diaries and carved figures and recordings, but when I am gone, Kyle and Travis will do what they want. What they want is $8 million. So I made a decision. I am deeding the back 40 to the Nez Perce tribe, not selling. Deeding as permanent conservation easement with restrictions prohibiting development, logging, grazing, and public access. The tribe agreed to accept the easement and manage the land according to terms I specified, including provisions for continued seasonal offerings and respect for the existing agreement. I met with tribal council last month in Lapwai. I expected skepticism. I got recognition. The elders listened. When I finished, one of them, Philip Oatman, in his 70s, told me his grandfather spoke of similar agreements in high country, arrangements between families and the old ones who walked the mountains before reservations, before treaties, before land was divided and claimed. He said the tribe would honor the easement not because they believed my story necessarily, but because protecting wild land and respecting what lives there is part of their responsibility. The back 40 will remain untouched, not because my sons will keep the agreement, but because the land will no longer be theirs to sell. It will belong to the tribe, held in trust, protected by people who understand that some places are sacred, not because a church was built there, but because the land itself holds something worth protecting. Kyle and Travis will still inherit the rest, 500 acres, house, cattle, equipment, enough to sell for a significant sum if they choose. But the back 40 will be gone from their control, and the agreement will continue under stewardship of people with longer memory and deeper respect for what these mountains contain. I signed paperwork 3 days ago, permanent and irrevocable. Rick Coleman called yesterday, furious, said I torpedoed the deal, threatened to sue. I told him there was never a deal. He hung up. I drove to the back 40 this morning, brought the usual delivery, but also a letter. I wrote it last night trying to find words for something that does not translate well. I explained what I had done, that the land would be protected after I was gone. The tribe would manage it. Deliveries would continue through arrangements with Philip Oatman's family. That my sons did not understand, but I had found another way to keep the promise. I left the letter on the stump, waited with a river stone. I sat in the truck and waited. After 20 minutes, the older one appeared, the same one who placed his hand on my shoulder months ago, the one I helped with the sick young one. He walked to the stump, picked up the letter, looked at it for a long time. I do not know if he could read English. I suspect not, but he held that paper in his massive hands and stood very still, and I knew he understood what it represented. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a gap in the bark of a nearby ponderosa. Then he walked to the truck and stood beside the driver's window, close enough I could have reached out and touched him. We looked at each other through glass, his face weathered, hair around eyes and mouth streaked with silver, eyes holding a depth of understanding that comes from a long life, lived with intention. He raised one hand and placed it flat against the window. I raised my hand and placed it against the glass from inside, matching his palm to mine, his hand twice the size of mine, fingers thick and powerful. Through glass I could feel warmth radiating from his palm. We stayed like that maybe 10 seconds. Then he lowered his hand, stepped back, and walked into the forest. I sat in the truck for a long time. Then I drove home. My name is Wayne Harper. I am 62 years old. I kept the promise my father made me swear to keep, and I found a way to ensure it continues after I am gone. The back 40 will remain protected. The agreement will hold. And somewhere in the deep timber at the back of what was once my family's property, a family that is not human will continue to live as they have lived for thousands of years, watched over now not by the Harpers, but by a people who understand that protecting the old ones is not about belief or proof. It is about responsibility. Kyle and Travis will be angry when they find out. They will feel cheated out of money they believed was theirs. But money is not an inheritance. What you pass down is knowledge of how to live in a place with respect for what was there before you and what will be there after. I have passed that down the only way I could, by removing the choice to violate it. The agreement my grandfather made in 27 was not just with the beings in the back 40, it was with the land itself, with the idea that some things are worth more than their market value, and that a promise kept across 4 generations is a foundation stronger than any deed or contract. I will make deliveries as long as I am able. When I cannot, Philip Oatman's grandson Caleb has agreed to take over. I have taught him the route, shown him the clearing, explained what to bring and when. He has not seen them yet, but he will. And when he does, he will understand what his great-grandfather understood, what my grandfather understood, what I have spent 62 years learning. We are not alone in these mountains. We share them with something older and wiser and more deserving of protection than we have ever acknowledged. And if we are very lucky and very respectful, they will allow us to continue sharing this space for another 100 years. The back 40 is safe. The agreement holds. And when I am gone, I will rest knowing I kept my word to my father, honored the promise my grandfather made, and found a way to protect something that should never have needed protecting but always did, because the world sees land as property and opportunity, and it takes someone who understands the deeper value to stand between what is precious and what is profitable and say no. Some promises outlast the people who make them. This one will outlast me, and that is enough. I think about that carving on my mantle every day now. I think about the old one building a fire in February cold to summon me, trusting that I would come, trusting that I would help, trusting that 98 years of kept promises meant something binding and real. I think about how easy it would have been to ignore that smoke, to tell myself it was not my problem, to let nature take its course. And I think about how that choice would have broken something that money cannot measure and contracts cannot protect. Trust built slowly over generations can be destroyed in a single moment of indifference. The agreement my grandfather made in 1927 was not about land. It was about recognizing that we share this world with others and that sharing requires respect and reciprocity and the willingness to keep your word even when keeping it cost you everything you thought you wanted. Rick Coleman offered me $8 million. The county wanted their road, the Forest Service wanted their fire line, and I said no to all of it because the back 40 belongs to something older than property deeds and more deserving of protection than my comfort or convenience. My name is Wayne Harper. I am 62 years old. I kept the promise my father made me swear to keep, and I found a way to ensure it continues after I am gone. The back 40 will remain protected, not by my sons who do not believe, but by a people who understand that some places are sacred, not because humans made them so, but because the land itself holds something worth honoring. And somewhere in those mountains, in timber so deep that sunlight barely reaches the ground, a family walks upright through shadows that have hidden them for thousands of years. They are protected now. And the agreement made in moonlight in 1927 between a homesteader and beings the world refuses to see will outlast us all.